All right, so we are back for chapters 9 and 10, again of the BFG, and it is the Blood Bottler and Frobscottle and Wispoppers. And I have to tell you, Frobscottle and Wispoppers is my favorite chapter, although I did really enjoy Schnozcumbers. So some new vocabulary words for these two chapters. Ghastly. So ghastly is shockingly frightful, like the sight of those other giants, I would think. Ecstasy is great joy, excitement, and happiness. And reverberated is like echoes coming from a sound, like the sounds are bouncing off the walls. They sometimes say like resounded. So when the sound travels through in a small area. So let's see what's going to happen in the Blood Bottler. Suddenly. That takes us right back where we left off. A great word choice. A tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, "Runt, is you there, Runt? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt?" "Look out," cried the BFG. "It's the Blood Bottler." But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten Schnozcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. "Who is you jabbling into here just now?" he boomed. "I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Piffle fizz," shouted the Blood Bottler. "Bug swallop," he boomed. "You is talking to a human being. That is what I is thinking." "No, no," cried the BFG. "Yus, yus," bloomed the Blood Bottler. "I is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper." The poor BFG was very nervous. "There's no one in here," he stammered. Why don't you leave me alone?" The Blood Bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. "Runty little scrum screwer," he shouted. "Piffling little swish figgler, squimpy little bottlewort, pruny little pug swizzler. I is now going to search the primroses." He grabbed the BFG by the arm. "And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out that tasteful little human being," he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back, but now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous Schnozcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The Blood Bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish pink. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. We can really picture that. Why? Great word choices. It was not in the least bit difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The Blood Bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. "You and your pippling bottles," he shouted. "What is you putting in them?" "Nothing that would interest you," the BFG answered. "You is only interested in guzzling human beings." "And you is dotty as a dog swaggler," cried the Blood Bottler. Soon the Blood Bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop, but she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The Schnozcumber, although as thick as a perbumbulator, was not going to hide her if the Blood Bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. Oh boy, what's she going to do? It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of those seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the Schnozcumber large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was a wet and slimy hiding place, but what did it matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The Blood Bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, there's that great word again, the Blood Blood Bottler grabbed the half-eaten schnozzcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. Sophie, where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be jumping off the high table, so where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthsome, rotsome glubbage you was eating, boomed the Blood Bottler, holding up the partly eaten schnozzcumber. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub squash. For a moment, the Blood Bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. That is the scrumdiddlyumptious schnozzcumber, he said. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a schnozzcumber, Blood Bottler? Human beans is juicier, the Blood Bottler said. You was talking rummyat, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the Blood Bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on. But please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchit for my supper. The Blood Bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the schnozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the Blood Bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I am positive you will be shouting out, oh, how scrumdiddlyumptious this wonder veg is. The BFG could see the greedy Blood Bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not healthsome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, the Blood Bottler said, I is going to taste these rotsome eats of yours, but I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I is smashing it all over your smudgy little head. He picked up the schnozzcumber. He began raising it on its journey into his mouth some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, don't, but that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly there was a crunch as the Blood Bottler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamoring together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Ugh, roared the Blood Bottler. Then he spat. All of these great lumps of schnozzcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. You little swine bugler, roared the Blood Bottler. You little pig swiller. He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the schnozzcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave. You was not loving it? The BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. Loving it, yelled the Blood Bottler. That is the most disgusterous taste that is ever touching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans. Eating human beings is wrong and evil, the BFG said. It is guzzly and galuptious, shouted the Blood Bottler, and tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans. Is you wishing to know why I choose Chile? I is not wishing to know anything, the BFG said, very dignified. I is choosing Chile, the Blood Bottler said, because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important that I has plenty of cold eats in this scalding hot weather, and the next coldest thing to the Eskimo is a chili bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly. Horrible, the BFG said. You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school chidlers, the Blood Bottler said. I is very fond indeed of English school chidlers. They has a nice inky-pooky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them. You is disgusting, the BFG said. And you is an insult to giant peoples, shouted the Blood Bottler. You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinky little squiddler. You is a pippling little pitsqueak. You is a cream puff nut. With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. Sophie, Sophie, where is you, Sophie? Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. I'm here, she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. Oh, I is so happy to be finding you in one lump, she said. He said. I was in his mouth, Sophie said. You was what? Cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened. And there I was telling him to eat the filthsome, rotsome schnozzcumber, and you was all the time inside it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, Sophie said. Just look at you, you poor little chidler, cried the BFG. You was all covered in schnozzcumber and giant spit. He set about cleaning her up as best he could. I is hating those other giants more than ever now, he said. You know what I should like? What, Sophie said. I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one. I'd be glad to help you, Sophie said. Let me see if I can think up a way of doing it. So Girls and Boys, in a story kind of goes like a hill where all these things happen and something big happens at the top of the hill, and then the story comes back down for the ending. We might be getting close to the top. All right, here we go. Frobscottle and Whizpoppers. Very funny chapter. By now, Sophie was beginning to feel not only extremely hungry, but very thirsty as well. Had she been at home, she would have finished her breakfast long ago. Are you sure there's nothing else to eat around here except those disgusting smelling schnozzcumbers? She asked. Not even Fizzwinkle? Not even Fizzwinkle, answered the big friendly giant. In that case, may I please have a little water, she said. Water? The BFG said, frowning mightily. What is water? We drink it, Sophie said. What do you drink? Frobscottle, announced the BFG. All giants is drinking Frobscottle. Is it as nasty as your schnozzcumbers? Sophie asked. Nasty? Cried the BFG. Never is it nasty. Frobscottle is sweet and jumbly. He got up from his chair and went to a second huge cupboard. He opened it and took out a glass bottle that must have been 6 feet tall. The liquid inside it was pale green and the bottle was half full. Here is Frobscottle, he cried, holding the bottle up proud and high, as though it contained some rare wine. Delumptious, frizzy Frobscottle, he shouted. He gave it a shake, and the green stuff began to fizz like mad. But look, it's fizzing the wrong way, Sophie cried. And indeed it was. The bubbles, instead of traveling upwards and bursting on the surface, were shooting downwards and bursting at the bottom. A pale green frothy fizz was forming at the bottom of the bottle. What on earth is you meaning the wrong way? Asked the BFG. In our fizzy drink, Sophie said, the bubbles always go up and burst at the top. Upwards is the wrong way, cried the BFG. You mustn't ever be having the bubbles going upwards. That's the most flesh-blunking rubbish I is ever hearing. Why do you say that? Sophie asked. You was asking me why? Cried the BFG, waving the enormous bottle around as though he were conducting an orchestra. You was actually meaning to tell me you cannot see why it is a scrawny mistake to have the bubbles flying up instead of down? You said it was flesh-bunking. Now you say it's scrawny. Which is it? Sophie asked politely. Both, cried the BFG. It is a flesh-bunking and a scrawny mistake to let the bubbles go upwards. If you can't see why, you must be as quacky as a duckhound. By Ringo, your head must be so full of frog-swinkers and buzzwangers, I is fritted if I know how you can think at all. Why shouldn't the bubbles go upwards? Sophie asked. I will explain, said the BFG, but tell me first, what name is you calling your Frobscottle by? One is Coke, Sophie said, another is Pepsi. There are lots of them. And the bubbles is all going up? They all go up, Sophie said. Catastrophe, cried the BFG. Upgoing bubbles is a catastrophe dystastrophe. Will you please tell me why? Sophie said. If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain, said the BFG. But your brain is so full of bug whiffles, I doubt you will ever understand. I'll do my best, Sophie said patiently. Very well then. When you is drinking this cokey drink of yours, said the BFG, it is going straight down in your tummy. Is that right or left? It's right, Sophie said. And the bubbles is also going into your tummy, right or left? Right again, Sophie said. And the bubbles is fizzing upwards? Of course, Sophie said. Which means, said the BFG, that they will all come swiftling up your throat and out of your mouth and make a foulsome belchy burp. That is often true, Sophie said, but what's wrong with a little burp now and again? It's sort of fun. Burping is filthsome, said the BFG. Us giants is never doing it. But with your drink, Sophie said, what was it you called it? Frobscottle, said the BFG. With Frobscottle, Sophie said, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result. Why nasty? Asked the BFG, frowning. Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they'll be coming out somewhere else with even a louder and ruder noise. Oh, whiz popper, cried the BFG, beaming at her. Us giants is making whiz poppers all the time. Whiz popping is a sign of happiness. It is music to our ears. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz popping is forbidden among human beings. It's considered extremely rude, Sophie said. But you is whiz popping, is you not, now and again? Asked the BFG. Everyone is whiz popping, if that's what you call it, Sophie said. Kings and queens are whiz popping. Presidents are whiz popping. Glamorous film stars are whiz popping. Little babies are whiz popping. But where I come from, it is not polite to talk about it. Redunculous, said the BFG. If everyone is making whiz poppers, then why not talk about it? We is now having a swiggle of this delicious Frobscottle, and you will see the happy result. The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous gurgling swig. It's glummy, he cried. I love it. For a few minutes, the big friendly giant stood quite still, and a look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then suddenly the heavens opened, and he let fly with a series of the loudest, rudest noises that Sophie had ever heard in her life. They reverberated around the walls of the cave like thunder, and the glass jars rattled on the shelves. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the enormous giant clear off his feet like a rocket. Whoopee! He cried when he came down to earth again. Now that is whiz popping for you. Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help it. Have some yourself, cried the BFG, tipping the neck of the enormous bottle towards her. Don't you have a cup? Sophie said. No cups, only bottle. Sophie opened her mouth, and very giantly the BFG tipped the bottle forward and poured some of the fabulous Frobscottle down her throat. And oh gosh, how delicious it was. It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream with just the fanciest trace of raspberries on the edge of the flavor. And the bubbles were wonderful. Sophie could actually feel them bouncing and bursting around in her tummy. It was an amazing sensation. It felt as though hundreds of tiny people were dancing a jig inside her and tickling her with their toes. It was lovely. It's lovely, she cried. Just wait, said the BFG, flapping his ears. Sophie could feel the bubbles traveling lower and lower down in her tummy. And then suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she, too, made the walls of the cavern ring with the sound of music and thunder. Bravo! Shouted the BFG, waving the bottle. You is very good for a beginner. Let's have some more. And so that's the end of the chapter, Frobscottle and Whiz Poppers. So great thing about Roald Dahl, he uses that vocabulary that's so exciting, and you can really see it happening. The other thing is the setting. You need to remember the setting is in London, so some of the language is going to be different. So chapters 9 and 10, two great chapters. So remember, when you're reading, visualize, make connections with your characters, see if you can think about how Sophie feels. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper about the whiz poppers. Good chapter.